My husband's colleague sat too close in the meeting room, and you won't believe what happened next. Even now, as I sit here recalling it, my heart stirs in ways I didn't expect at 60 years old. But before I tell you everything, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Which city, which little corner of the world are you in right now? I love knowing who's out there listening to me. And if you feel, even in the smallest way, that my story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe and give this video a little like. It feels almost like you're right here with me when you do, sitting across the table, nodding along. Now let me take you into that day. The day a simple work meeting, the kind I had been to 100 times before, became the doorway to something I never saw coming. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that felt like it might dissolve into the wallpaper if I didn't pay attention. The meeting room at my husband's office had always struck me as too cold, too polished. The long oak table gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and that sharp tang of printer ink. I usually kept to the corner during these gatherings, content to play the role of quiet observer, while the men spoke in their brisk, clipped tones about numbers, deadlines, and clients. My husband had invited me along because there was a dinner planned afterward. That was his way. Efficient, folding one obligation into another. I had no real part in the meeting, but I sat there with my notebook, pretending to jot things down, watching the way the dust motes floated lazily in the light streaming through the blinds. And then he walked in. Michael, my husband's colleague. I had seen him before, of course. He wasn't new. But that day, maybe because I was restless, or maybe because the air felt charged in some unnumbable way, I noticed details I hadn't before. His graying hair wasn't simply a sign of age. It framed his face in a distinguished way, softening the seriousness of his deep-set eyes. His tie was loosened just slightly, like he had rushed from one task to the next without caring to appear perfect. When he chose his seat, he didn't take the open chair across the table as I expected. Instead, he slipped into the one beside me, so close that the fabric of his sleeve brushed against my arm. It startled me, a small electric awareness that I tried to hide by lowering my eyes to my notebook. Why did he sit here? There was plenty of space. That was my first thought. My second thought was less practical, more unsettling. Do I want him this close? I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a warmth that seemed entirely out of place in that over-air-conditioned room. The men around the table began their usual exchange of figures and updates, their voices blending into a low drone, but my focus had shifted entirely. I noticed the subtle way Michael angled his chair toward me, how his elbow hovered near mine, as though pulled by some invisible magnet. I told myself it was nothing, just proximity, just coincidence. But my heart beat a little faster than it should have in such an ordinary moment. At one point, he leaned in to glance at my notes, though I hadn't written anything of substance. His breath carried the faint scent of mint, and when he whispered, "You take better notes than I ever could," I almost laughed aloud at the absurdity. Better notes? My page was practically blank. But the softness in his tone wasn't about the words themselves. It was about being seen, noticed, acknowledged. I realized, with a sudden pang, how long it had been since someone had looked at me like that. Not as a wife, not as a participant in the endless routines of life, but as a woman. The meeting dragged on, as meetings do, with charts passed around and conclusions repeated 3 times over. Yet for me, time had shifted. Every accidental brush of his sleeve against mine, every fleeting glance when our eyes met, built a quiet, undeniable tension. I thought back to my younger years, to times when I felt visible, when men would linger in conversation with me not out of politeness but because they wanted to. Life has a way of dulling those edges. You slip into roles, caregiver, partner, planner, the one who keeps everything steady. At 60, I had accepted, even embraced, that steadiness. And yet here, in this sterile conference room, I felt an ember flicker back to life. When the meeting finally ended, chairs scraping against the floor, I gathered my things slowly. My husband was already talking to someone across the room, waving his hands as he always did when he grew animated. Michael remained beside me, not rushing, not joining the others. "Do you ever get tired of these?" he asked quietly, gesturing toward the room, the table, the endless shuffle of papers. I smiled, the kind of smile that carried more meaning than the question itself, more often than I can admit. He chuckled, a low sound, and for the briefest moment, his hand brushed mine as we reached for our notebooks at the same time. It wasn't deliberate, or maybe it was. I couldn't tell. But the warmth of that touch lingered longer than it had any right to. As we walked out together, my mind was a storm of contradictions. Nothing had happened, not really. Just nearness, just conversation, just a brush of hands. And yet I felt different, as though some forgotten door inside me had creaked open again. That night, over dinner, I found myself watching my husband laugh with his colleagues, his voice booming with authority. I was proud of him, as I always had been. But across the table, when Michael's gaze met mine for the briefest of seconds, a shiver ran through me that I couldn't ignore. And that was only the beginning. That night after the dinner, I couldn't sleep. I'd lay beside my husband in the quiet of our bedroom, the soft hum of the ceiling fan filling the silence, and I replayed every small detail of the afternoon. The way Michael had chosen the seat beside me when he didn't have to. The warmth of his sleeve against mine. That almost laughable compliment about my notes. It was so little, and yet it wasn't. At 60, I didn't expect to feel unsettled by something so small. My life had been steady for years, predictable even. I woke up, I tended to the house, I managed my small routines, and I stood beside my husband at social events with practiced ease. And yet here I was, staring at the ceiling in the dark, my chest alive with something I hadn't felt in decades. The next morning, I told myself it would fade, that once the routine of life reasserted itself, Michael's nearness would become a vague memory. But then, as fate would have it, I saw him again sooner than expected. It was a week later at another gathering, this time less formal. A casual Friday lunch meeting my husband had invited me to join. The office felt lighter, the atmosphere almost jovial with people laughing and loosening ties. I told myself to sit somewhere different, to keep my distance, but when I walked into the room, Michael was already there, and once again he caught my eye. He smiled. Not a broad smile, but one of those small, knowing ones that seemed reserved only for me. Against my better judgment, I found myself sitting near him, though I tried to make it seem accidental. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows that day, catching the faint silver in his hair. He asked me about books, of all things, what I was reading, what I liked. It startled me because most of the men in that room never asked me much beyond pleasantries. Yet Michael listened intently, as though my words carried weight. "There's a difference," he said, leaning just close enough that only I could hear, between reading to pass the time and reading to feel something. I nodded, surprised by the accuracy of his words. "And which do you do?" I asked softly. "Both," he admitted, "but I prefer the latter." The conversation was nothing out of the ordinary on the surface, but beneath it ran a current that pulled me in. I felt seen in a way I hadn't expected, like he wasn't just hearing my words, but searching for the person behind them. Later, as the plates were cleared and people drifted into small clusters, he asked if I wanted to step outside for some air. My heart stuttered, but I agreed. We stood on the patio, the September breeze cool against my skin, carrying with it the faint scent of cut grass from the office lawn. I wrapped my arms lightly around myself, not from cold, but from nervous energy. "You seemed quiet during lunch," he said, watching me carefully. "I'm always quiet," I replied, trying to brush it off. "Not like that," he said gently. "Quiet in thought. Like you're carrying something." I looked at him then, really looked. His eyes weren't sharp or demanding, but steady, patient. I felt the urge to deflect, to laugh it away, but instead, I found myself saying, "Maybe I've forgotten how to be anything else." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of distant traffic filled the silence. He didn't reach for me, didn't intrude. But the space between us felt charged again, the same way it had in that meeting room. It was strange, standing there with him. I wasn't a young woman anymore, yet I felt the rush of being one, the curiosity, the nervous energy, the awareness of possibility. And yet there was no recklessness in it. There was respect, a mutual understanding that whatever this was, it was more about connection than anything else. When we finally walked back inside, my husband waved me over, and I slipped easily into the familiar role at his side. But something had shifted in me. I could feel it, a subtle awakening that lingered like the aftertaste of strong coffee. That evening, back at home, I caught myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror longer than usual. I studied the fine lines around my eyes, the softness of my cheeks, the streaks of silver in my hair. I had made peace with them over the years, but that night I wondered, could I still be noticed? Could I still be wanted, not out of habit, but because of who I am? The next few days blurred into one another, yet Michael's words, his nearness, his gaze, lingered in my mind. I told myself it was foolish, that I was building castles in the air. But deep down, I knew something had been stirred, something I couldn't easily put back to sleep. It wasn't about infidelity. I wasn't chasing scandal. It was about being reminded that beneath the roles of wife, mother, homemaker, there was still a woman inside me. Curious, alive, capable of feeling. And that realization both thrilled and terrified me. Because I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. A few weeks passed, and I found myself thinking about Michael more often than I cared to admit. Not in the way of fantasy or daydream, but in small, fleeting moments. When I poured my morning coffee, I would remember the way he had leaned close, his voice low. When I stepped outside in the late afternoon sun, I recalled that shared silence on the patio. It was as though the ordinary rhythms of my life had acquired an echo, one that always carried his presence. I didn't seek him out. I told myself I wouldn't. But sometimes fate has a way of arranging things, whether we ask for it or not. One chilly afternoon in October, my husband asked me to drop off some papers at the office. He had been running late for another engagement, and I didn't think much of it. I drove across town, humming softly to the radio, the trees lining the streets already shedding their amber leaves. When I arrived, the building was unusually quiet. Most of the staff had gone home early, and the hallways carried the hollow stillness that comes when workday energy has drained away. I walked toward the glass-walled meeting room, papers tucked under my arm, and that's when I saw him. Michael was seated at the far end of the table, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. A stack of files lay open before him, but he wasn't focused on them. Instead, he stared out the window, as if his thoughts had drifted far beyond the walls of that room. When he turned and saw me, his face lit with recognition, a warmth that startled me in its intensity. "You're here," he said, rising from his chair. I thought I was the last one. I held up the folder, just dropping these off for my husband. He gestured for me to set them down, and as I did, I caught the faintest trace of his cologne, clean, understated, the kind that lingers in the air just long enough to be noticed. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, his tone careful, almost tentative. I hesitated. A part of me knew I should leave, that lingering in an empty office with him was dangerous in ways I didn't fully understand yet. But another part of me, the part that had felt starved for something unnamed, nodded. "A few minutes," I said softly. We sat at the table, not side by side this time, but across from each other, a polite barrier between us. For a while we spoke of nothing in particular, the weather, the relentless pace of the office, even a book he had just finished. Yet underneath every word was a layer of something unspoken, a current that kept tugging at us both. At one point he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes held mine with a steadiness that made it hard to breathe. "Do you ever feel," he said quietly, "like life is moving so quickly you almost lose track of yourself?" The question pierced through me. It wasn't casual. It wasn't something you toss into conversation without meaning it. I swallowed before answering. "All the time," I admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if the person I used to be got left behind somewhere." He nodded as though my words were something he had been waiting to hear. "That's exactly it. We carry on, we do what's expected, but inside, we're still searching." I don't know why his words brought tears to my eyes, but they did. Maybe because it had been so long since anyone had spoken to me with that kind of honesty. I blinked them back quickly, embarrassed, but he noticed. He didn't comment, didn't press. He just let the silence stretch, comfortable and safe. When I finally looked at him again, there was something in his gaze I couldn't name. Not desire, not quite. At least not in the way I might have once understood it. It was deeper than that, softer. As if he was seeing me not just as I appeared, but as I truly was. The air between us thickened, and I felt my pulse quicken. I became acutely aware of everything. The sound of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the lights, the way his hands rested on the table, strong yet relaxed. I wanted to speak, to break the tension, but my voice refused me. And then, almost imperceptibly, he reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. It was such a simple gesture. No one else was there to witness it, no one to interpret it but us. His palm was warm, steady, grounding. For a long time, neither of us moved. I didn't pull away, and he didn't press further. We just sat there, joined by that quiet, wordless connection. In that moment, I wasn't 60 years old. I wasn't a wife, a hostess, a planner of schedules. I was simply a woman, holding the hand of someone who saw me. And that realization filled me with both exhilaration and fear. Eventually, he let go, his fingers sliding back across the polished wood. The absence of his touch was almost as powerful as the touch itself. "You should probably get going," he said gently, though his voice carried the same reluctance I felt. "Yes," I whispered, gathering my things. When I walked out of the office and into the crisp autumn air, I drew in a long breath, trying to steady myself. The world around me looked the same. Cars passing, leaves rustling, the sky dimming toward evening. Yet I knew something inside me had shifted irrevocably. That night, back at home, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen after my husband had gone to bed. I stared at my hands, remembering the warmth of Michael's against mine. It wasn't about romance, not in the way stories often tell it. It was about recognition, about being touched, not just physically but deeply, in spirit. And I knew then that the line between what was and what could be was thinner than I had ever imagined. The days after that quiet moment in the office felt different. On the surface, nothing had changed. I still woke early, still made my coffee, still folded laundry with the steady rhythm of a woman long accustomed to routine. My husband moved through his days with his usual certainty, filling the house with his confident voice, his laughter, his endless plans. Life went on, as it always does. But inside, I carried something new. The memory of Michael's hand over mine was like a secret flame, not wild and consuming, but steady, glowing, undeniable. It wasn't about the gesture itself. It was about what it represented. That someone had looked past the years, the roles, the assumptions, and had seen me. I found myself reflecting on my life in a way I hadn't for a long time. At 60, I had assumed self-discovery was behind me, that the person I was had already been written. Yet here I was, rediscovering corners of myself I had nearly forgotten. One evening, about a week after that encounter, there was another company dinner. My husband urged me to come along, and though I felt a nervous flutter, I agreed. The restaurant was warm, filled with the clatter of cutlery and bursts of conversation. Candles flickered on every table, throwing soft light against the polished wood and wine glasses. Michael was there, of course. When our eyes met across the room, it was like an invisible thread tugged at me. We didn't speak right away. There were too many people, too much polite chatter to get through. But eventually, as the evening wore on, we found ourselves standing together near the bar. For a while, we spoke about nothing significant. The food, the decor, the endless string of events this company seemed to host. But beneath it, the same current pulsed, that same awareness. At one point, there was a lull in conversation, the kind that might have been awkward with anyone else, but with him felt natural, almost necessary. He looked at me with quiet intensity and said, "You've changed since I first met you." I raised an eyebrow. Changed how? "You seem lighter," he said softly, "as though you've remembered something important." His words struck deep, because he was right. And it wasn't just because of him. It was because of what knowing him had stirred in me. A reminder that my story wasn't over, that my identity wasn't fixed in stone. "I suppose," I murmured, "I just needed to be reminded that I'm still here." He gave a slow nod, as though he understood more than I had said. For a moment, the world around us faded, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the swirl of voices. There was only that moment, that shared recognition between two people who had glimpsed each other's truths. But then reality returned, as it always does. My husband called my name from across the room, his voice full of good cheer, and I felt the thread between Michael and me loosen. Later that night, back at home, I lay in bed wide awake. My husband slept soundly beside me, and I stared into the darkness, my mind turning over everything that had happened. There was a temptation there, subtle but real. The temptation to imagine what might happen if I stepped beyond the lines of my life. But deep inside, I knew that wasn't the path for me. It wasn't about crossing into betrayal. It wasn't about chasing something fleeting. What I had found in Michael wasn't meant to replace my marriage or upend my world. It was meant to awaken me, to remind me that I was still capable of feeling, of connecting, of being more than the roles assigned to me. In the weeks that followed, I saw him at other gatherings. We shared smiles, brief conversations, the occasional knowing glance. But nothing more. And strangely, that was enough. Because the truth is, the most powerful experiences don't always need to be acted upon. Sometimes they are simply meant to show us what lies dormant within us, to remind us of who we are. Now, as I sit here telling you this, I don't feel regret. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for the reminder that life at 60 is still full of discovery. That even in the most ordinary places, a meeting room, a lunch table, a quiet office on a gray afternoon, extraordinary moments can find us. So if you're listening to me right now, wherever you are, in New York, in Chicago, in a small town tucked between cornfields or mountains, I want you to hear this. It's never too late to rediscover yourself, to feel seen, to realize that the story of who you are is still unfolding, no matter your age. And if you felt a flicker of recognition while hearing my story, if you've been reminded of something within yourself, then stay with me. Subscribe, leave a little like, not because it helps me, but because it's our way of saying to each other, yes, I'm here too. I understand. My husband's colleague sat too close in the meeting room that day. It seemed so small, so trivial. But from that moment, a door opened, not to an affair, not to scandal, but to a deeper awareness of myself. And for that, I will always remember him.